to be loved, to be revered. The power of love as the basis of a state has never been tried. Now, Machiavelli would, of course, roll in his grave at a line like this. Why? Machiavelli said it. All humans are disgusting, lowly, despicable people. Emerson has a different view of human nature, and by extension, the ideal of American democracy is predicated on this notion that every child is valued, and every child should be educated, right? This idea is a very Emersonian idea. Some will argue, this is way, I mean, come on, you gotta be kidding me. A state predicated on love? We must not imagine that all things are lapsing into confusion if every tender Protestant be not compelled to bear his part in certain social conventions, nor doubt that roads can be built, letters carried, and the fruit of labor secured when the government of force is at an end. In other words, he's speaking to those naysayers who say, if you don't have a government of force, you're not going to have a government at all. Are our methods now so excellent that all competition is hopeless? Could not a nation of friends even devise better ways? On the other hand, let not the most conservative and timid fear anything from a premature surrender of the bayonet and the system of force. For, according to the order of nature, which is quite superior to our will, it stands thus: there will always be a government of force where men are selfish, and when they are pure enough to abjure the code of force, they will be wise enough to see how these public ends of the post office, of the highway of commerce, and the exchange of property, of museums and libraries, of institutions of art and science can be answered. The idealist, he's painting in broad strokes. And I think Emerson understood that this is what he was doing. He was, of course, engaging in that famous is-ought dichotomy that Machiavelli makes so famous in The Prince, as we've said in earlier lectures. That is to say, don't tell me about the way Machiavelli, don't tell me about the way the world ought to be. He says, like these guys that want to build these imaginary governments, these worlds, like Plato and his Republic. Tell me about the way the world is. And Machiavelli says, I'll tell you about the way the world is. It's run by people who are better liars than other people. They're like the fox. They're cunning. They're smart. And they're ruthless. Emerson says about that, no. First of all, we've seen what that looks like. Second of all, why can't we try a state that's predicated on the notion that all of us are of great value and all of us should be taken care of by our government, not just the wealthy, not just the powerful? He says it finally in paragraph 18, we live in a very low state of the world and pay unwilling tribute to governments founded on force. There is not among the most religious and instructed men of the most religious and civil nations a reliance on the moral sentiment, he loves this line, moral sentiment, this phrase, moral sentiment, and a sufficient belief in the unity of things to persuade them that society can be maintained without artificial restraints, as well as the solar system, or that the private citizen must be reasonable and a good neighbor without the hint of a jail or a confiscation. It's an interesting question. After 9/11 in New York City, why is it that there wasn't tremendous amounts of looting and destroying of property? Why is it that so many people took care of other people? See, Emerson would point to it and he would say, that's what makes us so importantly humans, and by extension, Americans, that we understand we're all of great value and we can build our government with that notion. What is strange too, there never was in any man sufficient faith in the power of rectitude to inspire him with the broad design of renovating the state on the principle of right and love. All those who have pretended this design have been partial reformers and have admitted in some manner the supremacy of the bad state. I do not call to mind a single human being who has steadily denied the authority of the laws on the simple ground of his own moral nature. Such designs, full of genius and full of fate as they are not entertained except avowedly as air pictures. This notion of air pictures is, of course, his tipping of the hat to the people who would say, you are crazy to imagine that people will come together simply because they care for each other and they care for our country. Of course, many have pointed out that movements since he wrote this essay have happened in America that were built around the idea of soul love, as Martin Luther King Jr. would posit it, right? The idea that you don't hit back, right? Remember in his famous essay, he says oppressed people respond to oppression in three characteristic ways. One is acquiescence, you just sit down and give up. But the problem with that is you let the accuser, the oppressors, conscience slumber because he or she begins to believe that the oppressed deserve their oppression. Of course, the other response on the other end is an eye for an eye. That is to say, he calls it corroded violence and hatred. But he says it, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Well, then what is the third way? That Hegelian synthesis, as he talks about it in that essay. That is to say, it is that nonviolent resistance. Well, it's predicated, of course, on this notion of love of all humans, right? If the individual who exhibits them dare to think them practical, he disgusts scholars and churchmen. And men of talent and women of superior sentiments cannot hide their contempt. Not the less does nature continue to fill the heart of youth. It's significant that he comes to the youth when he says this, with suggestions of this enthusiasm, and there are now men, if indeed I can speak in the plural number. More exactly, I will say, I've just been conversing with one man. We think here immediately of Thoreau, and it may be Thoreau he's talking about, to whom no weight of adverse experience will make it for a moment appear impossible that thousands of human beings might exercise towards each other the grandest and simplest sentiments, as well as a knot of friendship or a pair of lovers. It is significant that Emerson will finish his essay on politics with the word lovers. Not citizens, lovers. And it becomes, I think, central to the tension in American thought. That when we are young, we often want to read an essay like this and say, yeah, why can't we have a government, that is to say, a coming together of people, that's predicated on those powerful virtues of wisdom and courage and self-discipline and justice, of love and honor. Of course, we begin to roll our eyes when we say, are you familiar with history? A few months after he writes this essay, the American Civil War, the First World War of the 20th century, the Second World War of the 20th century, as we pointed out in other lectures, they didn't call the First World War the First World War, because you don't call it a First World War until there is a Second World War. In other words, so many people had to die in the 20th century. Clearly, these ideas can't work. Emerson's response, and he would look at, for example, the accomplishments of someone like Martin Luther King Jr. and say, no, and somebody like Gandhi, no, but wait, what about the success of the civil rights movement? What about the power of nonviolent resistance? What did it take? Individuals with character who believed in something beyond themselves. This is, of course, often going to be this tension that we will reference. Well, that's the essay. Let's work now at level 2 and level 3. At 2A, themes, messages, again, the individual for Emerson is greater than the collection, right? That celebration of the individual as being, of course, significant in regards to how we think of government. Of course, laws are empty, useless, without true character. It's an interesting challenge for us to think about. Why are you here? What is the point of all of this education? There are statistics that will argue that by your senior year of high school, $1 million has been spent on each of you. The obvious question is, and for what? What specifically is the point of all of this education? Emerson would say, without the understanding that it's about development of character to form citizens, we're wasting our time here. Finally, of course, that's it. Education is the key. It's got to be about character development and citizenship, and not just about learning to make a lot of money so that you can gain power, so that you can somehow gain political power and precedence. Well, that's the essay. Let's look at level 2B, the rhetorical, not what Emerson says, but how he says it. I've spent quite a bit of time reading because it's such a compelling essay to be read out loud. Notice his love of the word pictures. That, for example, that notion of the raft, your feet are always going to get wet, but the raft never actually sinks no matter what happens. It gets flipped around or whatever, but it seems to float on the water. Of course, his hyperbole, especially in the last 2 paragraphs, this exaggeration, this overstatement, and of course the ending of the word lovers will call out, I think, to certain kinds of readers. Certainly Thoreau, I think, was very moved by this, refusing to pay his taxes to a government that will legitimate slavery, and of course the Mexican-American War, which for Thoreau and for many observers was really a war that was just fought over the annexation of Texas, which really was nothing more than a way to try and keep slavery in political reality, right? Ultimately culminating in the war. Note the emotional argument here as well. And this is an interesting question. Does this idea ultimately in slavery? Or rather, do we actually have to go to bayonets? He uses the term, the word bayonet. Do you actually have to fight a war to end slavery? And it certainly appears that's the case. So how do you come down on this? That will lead us, of course, to level 3. And there's still so much we should argue that's to be done if we will ever actually see a true democracy. At level 3, and how we're going to relate this to ourselves at 3a, relating to other texts, well, we've mentioned so many. Plato's Republic comes to mind versus Machiavelli's Prince. This is the is-ought dichotomy. Do you want to see the world the way it is or the way it ought to be? And how about this for a question? Is education, in your estimation, about helping you to see the way the world is, the real world, as adults like to use that term with you? Or, rather, should education be about talking about the way the world ought to be? Of course the world is a place where everybody jacks everybody up, but does it have to be that way? Can it be otherwise? So, for example, we'll pick up a novel like Golding's Lord of the Flies and ask, what went wrong on the island? Is it that the boar's head is right? Fundamentally, there is something wrong with us that will always lead us to resolve our conflicts with violence? Or, rather, can we find ways through peaceful cohabitation to live on this planet? This is going to be the tension. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty comes to mind. Rousseau's Social Contract comes to mind. Remember that first line, man is born free but is everywhere in chains. Think about the power. I've mentioned already Frederick Douglass, Frederick Douglass's narrative, Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. These are texts which I think need to be read in relationship to this essay. But maybe most importantly is Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. I think it's important to point out that we have the volume of Emerson in the Harvard Classics, but we do not have Thoreau's Walden. I think it should be there, and I'm going to go ahead and give lectures on each of the different chapters of Walden for that reason. I think it's significant that when Mortimer Adler put together his great book set of 1952, Emerson was not there. No essays of Emerson, which is fascinating. Why the conservative Adler did not want the essays of Emerson in his collection. And Thoreau's Walden also not there. I think these are radical ideas that probably we need to discuss and debate. So let's do it at 3b. How do you relate this to yourself? What is your view of this argument that one person is more important than all of the people, the group of people? Does that make sense to you in regards to politics and government? Do you think that the world is maybe more complicated now than in 1844, and therefore an essay like this is even more insane? Or do you think an essay and the ideas that are being shared here are maybe more important now than they've ever been in the history of the world? Do you think that love is enough? You'll, of course, remember the famous line from the Beatles, all you need is love. Do you think love is enough? And where does laws come into all of this? And is love a law? And how do you balance all of that debate? Do we need less government or do we need more government? What are your thoughts on this? Usually the argument is that conservatives argue for less government, liberals arguing for more government. But do those ideas of liberal and conservative really help us anymore, do you think? Should we maybe just get rid of the whole idea of political parties? And what are your thoughts about the way in which media plays a powerful role in all of that as well? Well, these are all compelling questions. I hope that they challenge you. We'll turn in our next lecture to his essay speech, New England Reformers, which is going to play this game. And we'll have to ask the question, how do you go about reforming or changing political institutions? And of course, those with power usually don't want to give them up, which of course for Marx will be the reason why he argues for that Marxist revolution, as we'll often talk about it. Of course, the 20th century had several of those, and none of them ended up working out very well. Many people said that's because Marxist revolutions were not actually Marxist. There's always going to be a debate about these ideas. I love that I have the chance to share them with you. Thank you.